What's his service record? I'm serious. Did he mow lawns for the government or something? The voice of Marine General Harold Kingsley cut through the secure conference room. He didn't laugh out loud. He spoke as if he were stating an obvious fact. Look at him. Denim jacket, worn-out shoes. A civilian consultant, Kingsley leaned toward the long table where senior officers sat, upright medals and insignia displayed neatly in front of them. In this room, he said slowly, we have people who have actually commanded real battlefields. And I want to know what a 73-year-old man with no uniform, no rank, could possibly teach us. A few heavy breaths could be heard. No one answered. At the far end of the table, Elias Warren sat still. No reaction. He didn't look up. Kingsley concluded, his voice dry and cold. Frankly, his presence here is a mistake. The tension locked the room from the very first second. A brief, awkward chuckle faded away, but the silence had not yet begun to fight back. If you believe that true courage is not found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have lived through war, subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our quiet heroes. Elias Warren did not respond. He didn't look up either. His gaze rested on the tabletop in front of him as if it were a familiar boundary between the present and the past, one he had learned not to cross unless it was necessary. His right hand lay still on the wood. The skin was thick, hardened. Old scars crossed over one another, uneven, unpolished, unreadable unless you knew how to read them. That hand did not clench. It did not tremble. It had nothing to prove. The room fell silent in an uncomfortable way. Not the silence of respect, but the silence that comes when no one wants to be the next person forced to meet the gaze of the general who had just spoken. A few younger officers turned their faces away. One pretended to take notes, though there was nothing new in front of him. Another lowered his head to straighten the insignia on his chest, as if staying busy meant he wouldn't have to choose a side. Elias remained seated, not because he hadn't heard, but because he had heard voices like this his entire life. There's a kind of silence that is not weakness. It is the habit of those who have stood in rooms where speaking at the wrong moment did not cost you honor, but someone else's life. Elias had learned to keep silent early on, when breathing had to blend into the dark, when one unnecessary word could mean an entire team would never come back. A young Air Force officer glanced at him once more, then quickly looked away. That look carried no malice. It carried confusion. Confusion about how one was supposed to look at a civilian consultant. Confusion because the man in front of him matched none of the profiles he had ever studied. Elias inhaled slowly. His chest rose just slightly, then settled again. His breathing was steady. No one noticed that it was the breathing of a man accustomed to waiting. Waiting for a signal. Waiting for an order. Waiting for the exact moment to say a single sentence, then return to silence. Is he not going to say anything? A whispered voice came from the head of the table. The question fell, then dissolved as if it had never existed. Elias heard it. He did not turn his head. He was used to being spoken about as though he were not in the room. On his left wrist, a faint indentation remained where a watch had once been worn. Not because the watch had been expensive, but because some things stay with you for so long that even when they are removed, they leave a mark behind. Like years that were never acknowledged. Like missions that never existed on paper. No one in the room knew that Elias had sat this way before in other places. In the jungle. In the dark. Among men who spoke little because every sentence could be the last. Back then, silence was not a choice. It was the condition for survival. A field-grade officer cleared his throat softly, then stopped. No one wanted to break this moment. Because everyone could feel that Elias's silence was not empty. It had weight. It pressed down on the room, forcing each person to ask themselves if he truly were nothing. Why did this silence make them so uncomfortable? Elias lifted his hand slightly, then placed it back in the exact same spot. A very small movement, but enough to make several heads turn sharply. Not out of fear, but because they suddenly realized this man had not disappeared. He was simply waiting. Shall we continue? Kingsley said, his voice still cold, but edged now with impatience. No one answered right away. Elias still did not speak. He had spent a lifetime learning that when a powerful man talks too much, the wisest response is to let him hear his own voice. And it was that very silence, not that it slowed Kingsley down, but that it pushed him to go even further. General Harold Kingsley did not stop. The silence of Elias Warren did not slow him down. It convinced him that he now held complete control of the room. "You know what I'm thinking," Kingsley said, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm trying to picture what he actually did during the Cold War." He tilted his head, staring straight at Elias. A janitor, a warehouse guard, or maybe the kind of man hired to clean up things other people didn't want to see. A few scattered laughs followed. Not loud, not unified, but enough to spread like a thin oil slick before dying out in embarrassment. Elias remained seated, back straight, eyes fixed on the tabletop. Kingsley pressed on, his tone sharpening. "We're talking about war, about blood, about ordering other men to walk into places they might not come back from." He paused for a very brief moment, then asked directly without detour, "Have you ever killed anyone?" The question dropped into the room like a heavy object. No one laughed now. A young officer swallowed hard. Another clenched his hand beneath the table. No one spoke to stop it. Elias did not answer, but his jaw tightened just slightly. It was the only sign that the question had touched something that did not belong in a room like this. Kingsley noticed the change. He pushed forward with words. "Or did you just stand behind other people taking notes, writing reports, and years later you end up sitting here in a room full of men who actually fought?" A chair shifted faintly. Then stillness. Elias heard every word. He heard them the same way he had heard similar words elsewhere. Not in conference rooms, but in places where honor was not spoken aloud, but measured in endurance. An older Navy officer glanced toward Elias, then turned away quickly. That look held no contempt. It held something more dangerous: avoidance. Kingsley smirked. "You know what's funny? People with nothing to show usually choose silence. But the ones who really fought," he tapped a finger lightly against his chest, "we don't need to hide inside that silence." Elias did not respond. Not because he lacked an answer, but because some answers once spoken would force the listener to carry a weight they had never prepared themselves to bear. His hand remained still, but the joints of his fingers tightened ever so slightly. An old reflex. The reflex of a man who had learned to control his body in moments where survival was at stake. A small voice came from the far end of the table. "Sir." Then silence. The speaker did not continue. Kingsley turned his head. "It's fine," he said. "We're just clearing up a misunderstanding." He turned back to Elias. "You have your chance, Go on. Have you ever killed anyone?" The room held its breath. Elias closed his eyes for a very brief moment. No one noticed. Or if they did, no one dared to speak. In that brief instant, memory did not arrive as images. It arrived as sensation. The sensation of a hand pressed tightly over another man's mouth. The sensation of holding silence so that the men behind you could stay alive. Elias opened his eyes. His gaze remained lowered, but it was no longer empty. He did not speak. He did not bow his head. He did not resist. And it was that silence that exposed a truth no one in the room wanted to admit. If he were truly nothing more than a Cold War janitor. Why did this question make the entire room feel so heavy? Kingsley exhaled, irritation slipping through. He had expected a reaction, a denial, anger. Instead, he received silence, a silence that made his own words sound too loud, too naked, too exposed. No one stepped in. No one objected. No one drew a line under the moment. The room, with all its ranks, insignia, and authority, became a witness to a public humiliation that no one had the courage to stop. And in that very moment, when no one spoke anymore, something else began to surface quietly, but irreversibly. General Harold Kingsley rose to his feet. The chair slid back just slightly enough for every eye in the room to snap toward him. He did not look at Elias. He looked around the room as if he had already decided that this exchange was no longer worth continuing. "I didn't come here to listen to ghost stories," Kingsley said, his voice firm and clipped. "We have real work to do. Stories from a bygone era." He shook his head. "Don't help us deal with the present." A few officers let out quiet breaths of relief, not because they agreed, but because the tension finally seemed close to ending. Elias Warren remained seated until he spoke. "Sit down." The voice was not loud, not sharp, not angry, but it stopped Kingsley mid-movement. The room froze for a single beat. No one believed what they had just heard, not because the words were harsh, but because of who had spoken them. Kingsley turned back, disbelief in his eyes. "What did you say?" Elias lifted his head for the first time since it all began. His gaze was calm, Not defiant, not pleading. Sit down, he repeated. The same tone, the tone of someone accustomed to speaking words that did not need to be said a third time. No one else spoke. No one dared. Kingsley stood there for a brief moment. Then slowly, he returned to his chair. Elias reached into the pocket of his denim jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate. Several people in the room tensed visibly, not out of fear, but out of the instinct of those trained to notice any unexpected movement. Elias took out an old notebook. Its corners were worn, the cover faded by years. No name, no markings. He placed it on the table in front of him. He didn't slide it toward anyone. He didn't hold it up for display. He simply set it down. The room fell silent in a completely different way than before. No longer the silence of avoidance, but the silence of recognition. An army officer leaned forward to look more closely. He didn't touch the notebook. He only looked, then slowly lifted his head. Sir? He hesitated. Is that... Elias did not answer right away. He let the question hang. Kingsley stared at the notebook with irritation. It's just a notebook. Anyone could write in it. Elias nodded slightly. That's true. He opened the first page. Handwritten lines appeared. Not neat, not polished, but firm and precise. Dates, coordinates, call signs. An Air Force officer half rose from his seat, then froze. His eyes locked onto a single line. His throat went dry. That's impossible, he whispered. Elias turned another page, then another. No storytelling, no boasting, just what needed to be written so it wouldn't disappear. Kingsley leaned forward. The confidence that had filled his eyes earlier had drained away. In its place was caution. What is this? He asked. Elias answered briefly. Missions that never existed. Another wave of silence washed over the room. This time no one laughed. No one looked away. A young officer spoke, his voice shaking. Sir, this line. Elias looked at him. Your father. The officer froze. He didn't need to hear anything more. He knew. Kingsley leaned back in his chair. His hand rested on the table, no longer tapping. Elias closed the notebook. He didn't push it away. He didn't clutch it possessively. He simply left it there. In the middle of the room. Among people who had once believed history only existed when it was stamped and filed. No one asked him to explain. No one dared. The room now understood what had appeared was not an object. It was a witness. And from that moment on, the invisible order of the room shifted. No command was given. No declaration was made. But everyone could feel it. Power was beginning to move away from noise and quietly toward truth. And once the truth had been placed on the table, it didn't need to raise its voice. It compelled everyone to listen. Elias Warren opened the notebook. Not slowly, not hurriedly. The yellowed pages turned, making a sound so faint it was barely audible, yet enough to draw the attention of the entire room. Not because the sound was loud, but because from that moment on, no one could treat it as an ordinary object. Coordinates, Elias said, his voice low and steady. Call signs, dates. He paused for a brief beat. Dates that do not exist on any map. He pointed to a single line. No explanation. No framing. These, he continued, are missions that never happened. A young Air Force officer standing near the middle of the table leaned forward. He read slowly. His lips moved with each handwritten word. Then he froze. That's impossible. His voice cracked, barely audible. Elias looked at him. Not probing, not avoiding. You recognize it, Elias said. It wasn't a question. The officer swallowed hard. Sir, he drew a deep breath. This line, that's my father's name. The room locked into stillness. Kingsley lifted his head very slowly. Other officers turned to look at the young man. No one interrupted. He was... The officer continued, his voice trembling. He was shot down when I was very young. The file says it was an accident. No details. No witnesses. Elias nodded slightly. There were, he said, but not in that file. He turned another page. Just one. 3 men, Elias said. Went in. 2 came out. The officer stepped back half a pace. Both hands were visibly shaking. You! You were there. Elias did not answer right away. He let the question remain in the room for another beat. Your father, Elias said slowly, did not run. He held the line until there was nothing left to hold. The officer raised a hand to cover his mouth. He didn't cry, but his eyes were red. He called us, Elias continued. Once. Then the line went dead. No one spoke. No one needed more detail. An older Navy officer stepped forward slightly. Sir? His voice dropped. How many lines like this are there? Elias closed the notebook. Enough, he said, to know that not everything is allowed to be remembered. Kingsley leaned forward. There was no mockery left in his posture. Only weight. What do you want? Kingsley asked. Not as a challenge, not defensively. Elias looked directly at him, for the first time. I don't want anything, he said. This notebook doesn't need honors. It only needs not to be dismissed as fiction. The young officer turned toward Kingsley. His voice was steadier now. Sir, my father once told me something, that a stranger pulled him out of hell. He called that man the quiet American. Elias lowered his gaze. Just slightly. I wasn't the only one, he said. Just the one who's still alive. The room began to change. Not through words, but through the way people stood a little straighter. Looked again at the notebook. Looked again at Elias. No one called him a civilian consultant anymore. No one looked at him like an empty seat at the table. The notebook lay still. It didn't boast of victories. It didn't demand credit. But it forced everyone in the room to do the hardest thing of all, to stand upright before a part of history they had unknowingly turned away from. And once history had been set in its proper place, truth no longer needed to prove itself. It was simply waiting to be heard. Elias Warren did not stand. He didn't need to. He rested one finger on the notebook, as if anchoring it to the present, keeping it from drifting away. We didn't call them operations, Elias said. Just entries. And if enough of us made it back out, that was a good night. The room grew quieter with each sentence. No one interrupted. No one took notes. Prisoner extractions, Elias continued. There wasn't always a rope. There wasn't always a helicopter. Sometimes there were only two hands. And one rule: silence. He paused. Not to create drama, but because that was the rhythm of someone who had learned to weigh every word. Close combat, he said. Not to win, but to avoid being detected. We learned how to end a life without making a sound. Not out of hatred, but because if we didn't, the men behind us wouldn't get a second chance. A young officer closed his eyes for a brief instant. Another pressed a hand to his forehead. There were countries, Elias went on, where no war existed on the map. But on the ground, people died every night. We were ordered to go there, and ordered not to exist. Kingsley leaned forward. Not to argue, but to hear more clearly. How many people did you save? Kingsley asked. His voice was no longer sharp, only dry. Elias didn't evade the question. 16, he said. Made it out. And the rest? Kingsley asked. Elias met his gaze. 47, he replied. Didn't come back. No one asked who the 47 were. The room was mature enough to understand. We didn't count by medals, Elias said. We counted by empty spaces in formation. Every empty space was a name. Every name was a person whose family would never be told the truth. Kingsley swallowed slowly. He had commanded wars. He had given orders. But these numbers lived outside every doctrine he had ever studied. Did you ever... Kingsley hesitated. I have to leave someone behind. Elias didn't answer immediately. Then he nodded. Yes, he said. And that's something no training course can teach you. We're trained not to look back, but no one trains you to live with what comes after. A Navy officer spoke quietly. Then why are you still here? Elias looked around the room. Faces that had once believed they understood war. Because those men can't speak, he answered. And because if we keep pretending those wars never existed, then the people who died in them will die a second time. Kingsley leaned back in his chair. He was no longer the man who had mocked at the beginning, just an officer confronting the limits of his own understanding. This is a different kind of war, Kingsley said slowly. No flags, no declarations, no clear ending. Elias nodded. And because of that, he said it demands a different kind of honor. The honor of finishing the job and disappearing. The honor of letting others have their names written down. The room was silent, but it was no longer heavy. It was the silence of people who had just been handed a truth they could not give back. Elias closed the notebook. No one objected. No one asked for more. The truth had arrived. It didn't shout. It didn't ask permission. It simply stood there, forcing every rank in the room to step back. And from that moment on, the question was no longer, what did he do, but how will we treat those like him? General Harold Kingsley stood straight. He didn't wait to be prompted. He didn't look around for agreement. "Sir," he said, his voice low and clear, "I apologize." There was no explanation attached. No but. No reference to the past or to rank. "I said things I should not have said," Kingsley continued. "And I said them because I did not understand. Not because you were undeserving, but because I had grown accustomed to a different kind of war." He paused for a beat, inhaled, then went on. "That was my fault, and I take responsibility for it." The room fell silent. No applause. No approving nods. Elias Warren looked at Kingsley. Not for long. Not sharply. He gave a very slight nod. "All right," Elias said. "Just one word. No smile. No sign of victory." "I don't need that apology," Elias added. "But I accept it. Because it isn't meant for me. It's meant for those who are no longer here to hear it." Kingsley lowered his eyes. He understood. A young officer spoke, still hesitant, "Sir Elias. So, what is the lesson?" Elias didn't answer right away. He looked at the notebook, then at the faces in front of him. "The lesson isn't in the notebook," Elias said. "It's in how you treat the things you can't see." He lifted his head. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "The most dangerous people," Elias said, "are the ones who are not allowed to exist. No names, no files, no history." A few people shifted slightly. The words landed. "We were trained to disappear," Elias continued. "But no one is trained to be forgotten. There's a difference." Kingsley spoke slowly. "And we've been confusing the two." Elias nodded. "For far too long." An older Navy officer asked quietly, "Then what should we do?" Elias looked at him, then at the room. "You don't need to build statues," he said. "You don't need to write books. Just pause before you mock, and ask yourself who you're standing in front of." Kingsley stepped forward one pace. Not to confront, but to stand beside him. "We'll fix it," he said. "Not with promises, but by changing how we listen." Elias looked at him. The distance in his eyes was gone. "That's enough," Elias replied. "Not for me, for those who come after." The room began to breathe again, not in relief, but in clarity. The younger officers looked at Elias differently now, no longer curious, no longer doubtful. They looked at him like a mirror, one that didn't reflect strength but responsibility. Kingsley turned to the room. "This meeting isn't over," he said, "but it has changed. And from today on, we will no longer call silence empty." Elias closed the notebook, placed his hand on the cover, said nothing more. No one asked him to stay. No one stopped him from leaving. But when he stood, every eye followed him, not because of power, but because of the reminder he carried. The story didn't end with an apology. It began a new obligation, the obligation to remember correctly. And when responsibility was placed on the shoulders of those who remained a legacy, began to take shape quietly but enduring. After that meeting, there was no press release, no press conference, only a small but decisive change issued quietly within the system. A new training directive appeared. Short, clear. It required every level of command to understand and respect forms of warfare without names. Silence was no longer treated as emptiness. No record was no longer treated as non-existent. Many young officers read the directive without knowing where it came from. They only knew that from that day on, when they encountered someone without a uniform who still had the right to enter that room, they would pause a moment longer before speaking. Elias Warren never returned again. He was not invited to lecture. He did not appear in any curriculum. His name was not placed on any list of honors. A few years later, he passed away quietly. No spectacle, no long line of escort vehicles. The farewell was simple. Family sat close together. There were not many old friends. They didn't tell stories. They only nodded when they saw one another. But at a distance, a formation of Marines stood at attention. No orders given, no reminders needed. Some, among that formation, had been in the room that day. They stood straighter than usual, not out of ceremony, but because they understood who they were standing before. The old notebook was placed down. No one read it. No one opened it. It lay there as it once had on the conference table years before, asking for nothing, proving nothing. A young Air Force officer, now older, bowed his head for a long time. He said nothing. But in that moment, he remembered Elias's low, steady voice. Operations that never happened. A short sentence, but enough to carry with him for the rest of his career. General Harold Kingsley arrived later. He did not stand at the center. He stood one step back. He did not give a long speech. He said only one sentence. "Thank you," Kingsley said. Nothing more. No one replied. But everyone heard. When the farewell ended, there was no applause, no praise. Only a silence that lingered one beat longer, as if no one wanted to be the first to break it. There are wars that do not need to be acknowledged to be great. They only need someone to remember them truthfully, and there are people who do not need to be named to be honored. They only need not to be forgotten. The notebook remained there. No one took it. No one kept it as a souvenir. It did not belong to one man. It belonged to the gaps history once passed over. As people left, no one said goodbye. They only nodded. A familiar gesture among those who understand that some words never need to be spoken. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and decency never retire, please share this video and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that not a single memory of theirs is ever forgotten.